Alright, we'll get us perfect, perfect. All right. Welcome back to another empowerment night for our spring empowerment week. Yesterday we had a lot of fun with Tennille. We did some seated Zumba, got our blood moving. I can see Dawn's face over there. She's like, yeah, it was a good time. And the rest of the week is going to be just as fun and energetic. Tonight we have Stephen here talking about accessible housing, and tomorrow we're going to learn about accessible travel, um, and then accessible college and how to live an empowered life with a disability. So a huge stacked week. I just want to thank everyone for giving us your time tonight and taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I want to thank our presenter for coming and donating a little bit of his time tonight. Um, Stephen is an accessible housing expert, and he also has a really fun podcast I've had a couple of our friends speak on. Julie, who is usually in the crowd with us, she has spoken a couple times with him. And he's going to share a lot of really useful information and has a really interactive presentation for us. So without further ado, you are welcome to take it over.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity. I am a person with cerebral palsy, and it primarily impacts my walking. I'm not a wheelchair user, but I do use a cane pretty regularly to get around. And I got into real estate. I'm telling you this right now without the presentation because this part isn't in the presentation. I got into real estate about almost 20 years ago because I wanted to do real estate a different way. I wanted to help people with housing and home ownership primarily, who were underrepresented, who didn't have anyone in their corner. And so I started doing this in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I continue to work. And in more recent years, as Brianna mentioned, I've launched a podcast all about housing and accessibility together, which I am very happy about. I've done more than 50 interviews now with various thought leaders around the country, including Julie from Canada, about what she does, all in the area of housing, people's different experiences and advocates of different experiences. So what I wanted to share with you guys today, this presentation is all about housing and home ownership and asking questions and thinking about it around the idea of owning housing. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions throughout as we go through. So I'm just going to roll into it, so to speak, and get started. So can everybody see the screen? Just give me a thumbs up or, okay, very good. And everyone can hear me okay? All right, terrific. Let's keep going. Let's go. So here's what I want to talk about with you guys today. I want to talk about how we define accessibility and the language of accessibility. I want to talk about the different kind of housing options and challenges that we have in our world, primarily from an American perspective. I want to talk about home ownership as opposed to renting, the pros and cons of that. I want to talk a little bit about Section 8 home ownership and talk about how that works and what that is. Many people aren't even aware of it. I want to talk a little bit about my podcast called Accessible Housing Matters, and resources available to you. That's what I want to go over today. So without any further ado, let's start with a question for you guys. Feel free to unmute and answer this, or to put something in the chat. What does the word accessibility mean to you? How do you define it?
For me, it would be something where you can be able to get a wheelchair in, move around, have room, kind of have free space, showers and bathrooms set up for a commode wheelchair, all those things.
Yes, that's great, Joe. That is a very physical, looking at it from a very physical point of view, and that's absolutely accurate. But Um, and thank you for sharing that. So one of the things that I learned very early on in doing my work is that every person's needs are unique. And so over the course of my professional life, we've had to customize our solution to meet very specific needs. And one of the things I want to point out is that just because two people might be using a similar style of wheelchair or appear to be, that doesn't mean that they have the same needs of their in terms of their housing. Depending on where their strengths and deficits lie around mobility, two people using the same kind of chair or may have very different ways that they want to get around inside their housing. Maybe they want to drag themselves around on they're maybe they're able to move out of the chair and they want to be able to drag themselves around on a floor with the strength of their arms when they're not using the chair, so they need some soft surface. Or maybe they're going to be in the chair all the time and get support for transfers, and in which case they need a hard surface. And so that's just a very simple example of how we have to think about accessibility very, very broadly. Um, I also want to talk, at least in the world of housing, that there's these different terms that are very misunderstood, and talk a little bit about what they are and what they really mean. We talk a lot about universal design, especially in the world of architecture. And when we're talking about in the world of architecture, we're talking about living spaces that are designed for use by anyone. Someone had put in the chat that for accessibility meant for them that anyone could use it or appreciate something. Um, some architects are working very hard to establish standards of building that will work for if not everyone, then most everyone. And so when we talk about universal design, we're talking about right from when a building is being developed, when a structure is being developed, and it actually goes far beyond just the physical structure. It talks about universal access and design for the egress and ingress, getting in and out of the property, and you can even take this even further. One of my podcast guests um, a couple of years ago in Idaho is trying to create universally designed communities, universally designed subdivisions. It's kind of sad that, someone might modify their house to be accessible for a person to use their chair and get around in their wheelchair, yet they can't go visit their next door neighbor, or they can't really truly access the corner store or whatever it is. So universally designed communities, I think, is where this is needs to go. Another term you might hear around housing is visitability. And when we talk about visitability, all we are talking about is housing with at least one bedroom and one bathroom on a um, pathway with no barriers or thresholds. Um, Another term that you might hear is ADA compliant, and I have a lot of trouble with this term. We see this in real estate circles by people who don't know the disability world at all, but it's a very misleading term. ADA compliant is a claim that the space meets the definition of accessibility as specified in the Americans with the Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA, which I think many of you may be aware was groundbreaking legislation on disability civil rights passed in 1990. That basically is the reason why government buildings have wheelchair ramps, and why when you go to a new construction site, the little trailer out front has a wheelchair ramp, but they're building units that no one in a wheelchair can get into, which I find ironic in the extreme. And why is that? Why do they have these trailers that are accessible outside sales offices of new construction, but the units aren't accessible? Because the ADA does not apply to residential housing for the most part. It only applies, the Americans with Disabilities Act only applies to commercial and government space and industrial space. So Although the ADA has made a huge difference in perception and the way we use public spaces, it has nothing to do with single family homes, except in one really, really kind of arcane way. And that is when the housing is built using federal money. If there is a government money, if there's government financing involved in building a multi-unit apartment building, for example, whether there's designated money for low-income housing in that apartment building or not, then the Americans with Disabilities Act has something to say about that. But for the most part, it has no relevance. So if you are looking at a home listing on Zillow, for example, and it says that it's ADA compliant, you are talking with the agent who put that in there doesn't know what they're talking about. It doesn't mean anything. Aging in place. This is a really popular idea that if we could modify living environments so people don't have to move when they lose their physical or cognitive capacity, then that would be really good. You know, it's a lot cheaper to stay where you are and a lot less traumatic. Moving is traumatic, whether it's a positive move or not, it's a big deal. It's very disruptive. Anyone who's ever packed an apartment or a house and had to move from one place to another knows this. So if we can age in place, the problem is we've never built our housing stock this way, right? We've never built it with an eye towards this. There are some attention to this in the idea of senior housing, you know, the 55 plus, where they sort of plan for transition to less and less mobility, less and less mental capacity in the way they design some of these complexes. But certainly it isn't really thought of at all. It's like planned obsolescence. You know, they don't, the way they design, planned obsolescence is the idea of in manufacturing that you don't want your product to last forever because you'll never sell new product and your clients will love your product so much they'll never buy a new one, right? And so that's what planned obsolescence is. Well, we can sort of imagine housing to be a little bit like that when we talk about new construction. It isn't really designed to be lived in most cases, for a whole life. So it raises the question, well, why? Why isn't it designed that way, right? So anyway, when you hear aging in place, that's what they're talking about. So you might be on this call because you're interested in housing, because maybe you have a housing issue. So what are your options for resolving your housing issue? And I put in 4 here that are typical. One is aging in place. If it is possible to stay in your housing and simply modify it, make it work better, then that is always worth exploring. Supported living arrangements around the country, they call this by different names and it has different models, but this is the idea of moving into some sort of environment or having support for what your needs are as a person living with accessibility needs. Group homes are a very common example of this. Brianna is asking, do you think saving and building an accessible home is a good option over making an old home accessible? Well, the short answer for that, Brianna, is it really depends. It really, really depends, because some old homes are not at all amenable. They're not at all built in a way that allows for cost-effective renovations. I mean, I think about old Victorians. When you go to cities that are more than 150 years old, you'll see these old Victorians with their narrow hallways and their really steep roof lines. They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous architecturally, but they're not the least bit accessible, and so modifying a home like that could be way more expensive than moving from it, unfortunately. On the other hand, if you live in a 1950s rancher in Southern California that is already one level and already has a big kitchen and wide hallways, maybe all you need to do is build a ramp to cover for a couple of steps at the front entryway and the rear entryway and put in a roll-in shower, or it could be a lot much easier to age in place there. A third option is to move to a rental property and make it accessible. There are lots and lots of rentals that are being built that are subject to recent amendments to fair housing laws and recent amendments to building codes in some of the more the states that have been more aggressive with their building code rules that are accessible, that are zero threshold at least, with wide hallways and big bathroom and kitchen footprints. So that is absolutely a possibility. And then of course buying your own property is an option. And we're going to talk about all of this. So the biggest problem in accessibility in housing right now is actually affordability. The housing prices have gone up all over the country, and they've gone up so much that it has become, people who aren't making six figures are priced out in many of our markets. Not everywhere. I mean, I can only speak about my market with any, good degree of confidence. I mean, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is probably the first or second most expensive market in the whole country. I don't know what it's like in, Wyoming or in Mississippi or even in rural Massachusetts, but wherever you are in the country, prices have gone up a lot, or at least in most places. And finding affordable housing is a real problem. We have a huge supply problem. Just as an aside, from a real estate perspective, you hear on the news every day about how the housing market is, how the economy might be going into recession and everything is bad out there and it's all so awful. And everyone knows in the last recession, the housing market kind of collapsed. Don't hold your breath waiting for the housing market to collapse. If we do go into a big recession, you will be maybe surprised that housing prices hold their own and even continue to go up a little bit. Why? Because of the fundamental economics of supply and demand. We don't have enough housing. We have too many people needing it. Nothing is showing that there's suddenly going to be more supply. But I'm a bit off topic, but it's really relevant now because the media is telling you misleading things about where we think housing is going to go. Lack of accessible housing. So if you have low income, if you're on SSI or SSDI or something, and you are living in a big city which has high housing costs, not only are you given a whack because you can't afford a rental at market rates, or buy a down payment or whatever, but there's not a lot of property. If you live in a community with older housing, there isn't a lot of property that's accessible to begin with. There just isn't in my area. Now, I mean, some of you might live in more newer communities where there is more accessible housing, but I haven't experienced that where I work. And so what ends up happening in my area is that, maybe 1 in 50 homes is accessible for a wheelchair user with nothing needing to be done. I mean, with a roll-in shower and big wide hallways and roll-under sinks and all the things we want to see, kitchens with cabinets that are all accessible without having to stand up, right? All that stuff. Zero path of travel, not just in and out of the house. Well, I'll get to it in a minute, but, really good stuff. 1 in 50, 1 in 75 houses have that. So we're not only dealing with lack of accessibility, lack of affordability, we have lack of accessibility. And the problem is that doing renovations can be expensive and sometimes not even limited. Like you can't do it. There's limited options because, as I said, of the architecture. And the other problem in the market, including in the rental market, limited accessibility expertise by landlords, by real estate agents, by developers of property, by all the folks that we would really be happy if they had some expertise around this. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to get you all to be able to see. I want to see the faces, but I also want to be able to read my screen. Okay, all right. So these are our challenges. So when we go look for property, we struggle because there are so many older homes and neighborhoods in my area. Again, I'm speaking about built up urban communities with narrow hallways, lots of steps, poor access to switches and receptacles, poor location of cabinetry in the kitchen, etc. And the rules requiring housing to be built to be accessible or to be accessible in the first place, rental housing, is really limited. There's not much there. And worse, let's suppose somebody buys a house and they modify it so it works for their person who lived there who was using a wheelchair. Well, there are no laws or rules that require such property to be sold or rented to people who would take advantage of those features. So the sad thing that happens is after it gets used by the person who needed those features, a new owner comes in and tears it all out, thus diminishing the stock and supply. It's really sad, right? So there is good news though. Because, as I said, of building codes, newer construction is much more disability friendly, much more. You're going to see anything built after 1990, any multi-unit apartment building built after the 90s, big hallways, big elevators, big bathroom and kitchen footprints, open design for the kitchen that make it so much better than anything built in the 80s or earlier. That means that many apartment buildings and many condos are what I call mostly accessible. And what I mean by mostly accessible is that they have at least a zero path of travel to the unit door. Many of them do. Do they have bathrooms that are going to work? Maybe, probably not. You know, is the kitchen cabinetry where we want it to be? Probably not. But those are things that, you know, with a modest investment are fixable, right? And that's the next point I'm making. You can modify property for accessibility with just sometimes minor modifications. We call that adaptable property. And we have more attention paid now than ever before to fair housing laws and reasonable accommodation provisions in it to make housing work better for more people. If you are looking online for housing, whether you're looking for rental or looking for property to own, please beware of the online search. Please beware of the online search. Roberta has a question. Exactly what happened to the accessible home? Oh, did I miss the first part of this? I don't see the first part of your message.
It wasn't
Oh, I see.
a
You're sharing
question.
your story.
Yeah,
Yeah. Parents built an accessible home, but it ended up being sold to a young family that didn't have any need for the features in the home that they put in there. Yeah.
It was the perfect home for somebody who needed to age in place or somebody with disability. Super wide hallways, super wide doorways, zero, I don't know what you call it, where they could just roll in
Thresholds.
out of the door,
Zero
zero
thresholds.
thresholds,
Eh.
lowered light switches, roll-in bathroom. It had everything. And I went to a
You know,
young
it's such a shame. The same
is.
fair housing law that protects you or is supposed to protect us, that means people can't discriminate against people who use a wheelchair, is the same housing law that says the seller can't discriminate and favor a person who has a wheelchair user in their
Yeah.
family. So kind of perverse, right?
It is. It
So I want to
certainly
talk a
is.
little bit. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about online searches, and then I'm going to ask you a question. When you are looking at housing online, note that there is no consistent format or verification of accuracy for anything having to do with access. What one person, one leasing agent or one real estate listing agent might say is accessible or wheelchair accessible or ADA compliant, God forbid, is going to mean something different. There's no standard around that. Many real estate agents and landlords don't properly identify the accessibility features when they advertise their properties. There are properties that are zero threshold, no steps to the entrance, but are completely inaccessible once you get in, including hallways that are too narrow to turn a wheelchair in. And the other thing I want to say about this is that pictures don't tell the whole story. Pictures don't tell the whole story. Pictures can be incredibly misleading about space. When you're looking at properties, getting serious about them, seeing them physically in person with an advocate, ideally, is really, really important. So it raises a question I wanted to ask the group. What challenges have you had finding accessible housing. I was hoping somebody could share some of their experience here. Oh, Brianna, could you just share what you put in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. So me and my roommate were both wheelchair users, and we've been searching for a home since last January. Her and I got approved for a home loan together, and like with our low incomes and with our our with our low incomes, we got a very small loan. So it's only like $120,000, and for that price, trying to find something that's accessible and big enough and all of the above is just it's been really impossible. It's just a lot the houses here are just really old, and we'd have to put if we bought a house, you just have to invest so much more money than it's in our budget to fix them up. Because like you said,
Yeah,
the age of the houses are just they're just too small to even try to manipulate into something better. So honestly, at this point, we're just kind of putting the search on hold, and and that's why I asked the question earlier, is because really realistically at this point we're thinking that saving and just building something new from scratch is going to be our best option, because then we don't have to try to change a house to us. We can just build it right away from us. But in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, we've struggled with finding things in our price range that are accessible.
yeah. It's not the slightest bit of a unique problem, right? And so and that's a combination double whammy, like I was talking about before. It's not just finding an accessible place, it's finding an affordable, accessible place. Because if you have unlimited money, then there's no problem. You'll do whatever you want. You could tear down the whole thing and build something new, right? Um, so thank you for sharing that, Brianna. So, oops. So what do we do? So, I'm a bit of a unicorn. There aren't a lot of real estate agents who do real estate for people with disabilities and their families. So just to give you an idea of how we do it, when we're working with clients who have mobility challenges, sometimes that's wheelchair users, but it may not be always. We are concerned about not just the entranceway, but thresholds, all the thresholds, whether it's from the street or from the car they're exiting or from the bus stop they're getting off of a transit vehicle from, to all the places, not just in the property, but on the lot of the property too. If it's a single family residence or if it's a condo, they should be able to get to the outdoor swimming pool. I mean, they built these condos and there's zero path of travel only from the garage to the elevator. You can't use the main entrance because it's staired. And then they have these elevated pool decks. So if you live in that building, and even if you can get to your unit, even if your unit is beautiful and accessible, a lot of these buildings were built years ago, and there was no requirement in the building code that the pools be accessible. Isn't that awful? So this is what happens with the 70s and 80s. So we look at that. What is the access and turning radius for the kitchen and the bathroom and hallway width? Are the hallways narrow? Even if the chair can get through it, even if someone in the chair can navigate one direction, can they turn their chair to get into a room, right? Um, we're concerned about vehicle access. What's it like from a parked accessible van, from a rear loading or a side loading accessible van? Where is it going to go? Where does the van going to park? All those types of things. Balconies, access to and from balconies, and elevators. I sometimes see these buildings that have beautiful spacious units in these older buildings, but the elevator shaft is from the 1950s and it's really narrow and you can't get a wheelchair in it. Or if you can, there's no room for anybody else. I mean, many of our clients are not independently living with a wheelchair. They're folks who are support care providers who will be with them all the time, helping them to go from point A to point B. And if only one of them can get in the wheelchair, that's a problem. We also work with a lot of clients on the autism spectrum, and this can be a really cool group of people to work with, and they have housing needs too, even if they don't have a physical challenge. One of the things we assess with autistic folks or people who have cognitive challenges more generally is, do they have the level of independent living skills that are needed for the location that they're looking at renting or owning? Where is this location in relation to work and school and supports they might receive in their communities? And how's the transportation going to look like? How suitable is this space for care providers or assistants? How suitable is the owner renter for property management and taking care of this space? What support is out there? I've done some really fun podcast episodes about the new technology and how new technology is providing for what we call remote support services, where people can be connected. In the old days, they had the commercials, you wear the thing around your neck, and if you fall and you can't get up, you press a button. Well, this has gotten way more sophisticated, and people actually have iPad connections with these remote services that will help them with taking their meds, automate taking meds, automate turning on and off lights, automate reminders about things to do, giving people the ability to live independently when before they would have needed so much in-person support. It's really interesting stuff. All right, so renovation. If you want to age in place, this is the best solution when we can do it. The property has to be suitable and the costs have to be reasonable. There are cities, bigger cities, that might have grant and loan money for people below a certain income threshold to do accessibility renovations. I know that's popular in some of the cities where I live in. The funds are usually very limited and on a first come, first served basis each year. Sometimes such things are available at the state level, not just at the city level, maybe even at the county level. It depends on your city, state setup and what it is. But I would research that if you're looking at renovating. There are out there, I don't know about every community, but certainly in where I am, accessibility specialist contractors whose whole niche in doing construction is around access. I know 3 or 4 people in my area just like that. Architects who are specialists in universal design and designers. I interviewed a lady for my podcast about a year ago who was an interior designer who did kitchens and bathrooms, and she could just rattle off all these really clever, great ideas to make kitchens and bathrooms work better. She was a great conversation, just a wonderful conversation. So there are specialists. Dawn is sharing that she bought a new lamp and the salesperson suggested a smart light bulb so she didn't have to stretch for the on-off switch. It's an app on my phone, turns it off, on, gives level of lighting, and a night light option. Absolutely, Dawn. And I've experienced the same thing. I use the Alexa service with Amazon, and I have it turn my lights on and off and do all that sort of stuff. And it can do all kinds of other cool things. It can control your thermostat. It can control your TV. It can help you with all kinds of physical things like that. These smart home technologies are continuing to advance and change the world. It's awesome. It really is awesome. All right, I need to keep moving along here. So here's the question, and this is rhetorical, but you're welcome to answer. How can I afford to buy a home on government benefits? This comes up a lot in dialogues I have with people. They say, Stephen, you're trading in a false dream. I can't possibly own a home on my SSI amount of money. So let's talk a little bit about government benefits if we could. First thing I want to really stress, if you want to be a homeowner and you are getting government benefits, they cannot take away those government benefits or limit them because you buy and own your own home. In fact, it actually says so in the SSI legislation when they created Social Supplemental Security Income and SSDI, Social Security Disability Income, that they can't take away government benefits because you buy and own your own home. Some benefits, such as SSI, it says Medi-Cal here, but I'm talking about Medicaid, may limit how much money you can have in your bank account every month. If you're on SSI or on Medicaid, you might be limited to $2,000 in your bank every month, which, as you all know, is a pittance. They haven't changed that number in 50 years. It's ridiculous. And if you have Medicaid, it might be repayable. It's not necessarily always just going to come to you. The cost of the Medicaid may be repayable to the government in the future. So those are some things that you should know. So if you're on SSI and Medicaid, you can only have $2,000 in the bank if you're single, or $3,000 in the bank if you're married at the beginning of every month. So this was a real problem. It was a real problem. It's less of a problem than it used to be. So the number one thing that we've now developed to avoid this problem is something called an ABLE account. ABLE stands for better life experience, something better life experience. I forget what the A stands for. ABLE accounts are great. They allow you to save money like a college account, like a college savings account, and they can't count that money towards your SSI limitation of 2,000 or 3,000. So now you can save over $100,000 in these things, $16,000 a year. Many states have these at the state level. We call the one in California CalAble. Every state has one of these things. What I want to say is there's a national one, and then there's many states that have their own savings account. And sometimes they'll give you a debit card, and you can actually use that account for debit card use too, which is really cool. I think one has to be cautious about any kind of savings account that you're using using debit cards on, because then it comes like a checking account and suddenly there's nothing left in the account because but apart from that, this is an amazing thing. It shelters your income. You can use this to shelter Section 8 rental payments. So right now, if a family member contributes to the rental payment for a person who is collecting SSI, then it reduces the amount of SSI the government will give them every month, but not if the family member puts the money in an ABLE account and the ABLE account is used to pay for the rent. So that is a really cool thing. And the IRS is fully aware of it. It's kind of a money launder, right? But it is totally legal and totally cool. Another way that you can get around this limit for home purchases is using gifted funds. Family members can contribute directly to the account for the house, whether you use a lawyer or what they call an escrow account out here. However, you're financing the purchase. Funds from family members, what we call gifts, can go direct and thus overcome the problem of you putting the money in your bank account. Many large cities, states have down payment assistance programs, which are pretty amazing things in themselves. And you don't have to save money to buy your own home. I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. All right. A little bit about achieving. That's the word. I forgot I had the ABLE slide in here. Right. So ABLE, achieving a better life experience, save dollars without losing benefits. You have to be 26 years of age or younger at the time of your diagnosis with your circumstance, your physical circumstance, or whatever the disabling condition is. You can save up to $16,000 a year, and you can use it for home purchases, rent. You don't need to collect benefits to qualify, by the way. So let's suppose you are earning an income independently of benefits. You're not even on SSI or SSDI. You can still open an ABLE account and you can still save with it as long as you fit the other criteria. All right, let's keep going. I was talking about down payment assistance. There's two main types. So we're not going to get into down payment assistance programs because every state, every city is a different mishmash. Talk to local people about that. But there are two general models. Number one is something called a silent second mortgage. So you get the first mortgage for your house, but then they give you more money, which in a mortgage that is called a silent one, because you don't have to make any payments until you sell the house or refinance the house. So that's the main type, or at least one of the types. So let's suppose you're buying a $200,000 property and your first mortgage is, say, $150,000. Maybe you get $30,000 in a silent second mortgage and you only pay monthly payments on the first one, not on the second one. You don't owe the money back on the second one until you sell the loan or change your first mortgage finance. The second type of down payment assistance is what they call shared equity or appreciation. So in this case, that same $30,000, for example, You don't have to make any payments, just like the other one, until you sell or refinance. But instead of them charging you any kind of interest, they get a cut of your profit. When the property is sold at a profit, they get a share of the profit. And that is also depends what's available, depends where, and all that. There's all kinds of details. A third type of thing that's become more popular recently is a grant or a forgivable loan, usually for smaller amounts, but still. In my state, they had a $5,000 forgivable loan. And every year, over 5 years, $1,000 of the loan would be forgiven. So by the time you got to the 5th year, the 5,000 was never, you didn't have to repay anything, which basically meant it was free money, which is very cool. So you will find programs like that coming and going all the time. And it all depends on where you live, what you can access. Talk to local lenders about this. I want to talk a little bit about Section 8 home ownership as we wind up here. A lot of people know about Section 8, which is the federal government program to subsidize, to give you a rent subsidy. And you take your voucher to the landlord, and the landlord accepts you as a tenant, and you pay like 1/3, and the housing authority pays 2/3. Well, you can, in many communities, use this voucher you have for a mortgage payment instead of rent. So what happens is, instead of that mortgage payment, instead of that rent payment being sent by the housing authority for their 2/3, instead of it going to the landlord, it goes to the mortgage holder, to the bank, the lender. And as a result, you have a subsidized mortgage. To qualify for this, you must already be on Section 8 in most parts of the country. Not very many housing authorities offer it. You have to check with the housing authority where you want to live. Even with the existence of this program, it typically takes a long time to put into place and to make it work. And it doesn't work if the buyer doesn't have good credit and at least a little bit of money. There are permutations. If this interests you, first step is to contact the housing authority in your area where they have, and find out if they even offer it. Second step is to contact a real estate agent who might ideally have some experience with it. The housing authority person may know a local realtor who they've done deals like this with. Go to them. Don't just work with any agent. All right. The last thing I wanted to mention was my podcast. I wanted to tell you guys about it because it's my labor of love. I don't make any money from this podcast. I don't have advertising on it. I simply wanted to share conversations with people about housing and accessibility. So I've done more than 50 interviews. I'm really excited about it. And I just launched season 3, and great conversations about all aspects of housing. I call it the intersection of housing and accessibility. So I encourage you to check it out at this link, which Brianne is going to share later as well. Here are other links. And this is links to my real estate websites and my social media feeds. And we'll share those too later. And if you can't wait for it to be shared, if you take a picture of this QR code, most cameras will allow you to then click to my contact information and save it to your phone, so you can phone me or text me at your will. Or you can just, if you don't have your camera, can't do a picture of the QR code and take you to my contact page, the contact information will be in the picture you took anyway, because it's underneath the little QR code for you to reach me. So more contact information. And that is everything that I wanted to share. And I want to make sure I leave some time for your questions. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you, Dawn.
I do have one quick question. I know that you're based in like the San Francisco area, but do you have any like resources for people who may be in other states, or do you help individuals out of state? Or do you share resources for people who might be in other states, or do you just kind of
So,
suggest them starting research kind of
so
individually?
the sad thing is that there's very, very few real estate agents that do what I do. I'm somewhat of a unicorn. There are scattered around the country, maybe 3 or 4 people who have done enough work in this area that we would say they have some specialization. There's another group, a little bigger, of real estate agents who have some experience working with clients who use wheelchairs, who could be helpful. Um, there are a lot of nonprofit agencies that might have connections to expertise around this. So if anyone wants more information, I'm always happy to share information. I'm not licensed to represent buyers or sellers out of California, but I do have a huge network of real estate agents, and I have a huge network of contacts through my work on the podcast in many, many states. So if somebody wants more information, shoot me an email that they want me to connect them with resources in their states. And if I have anything, I will give you that, make the appropriate information available, whether it's an email introduction or just a list or whatever it is. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. But and I'll do what I can. I'll absolutely do what I can.
Well, perfect. Well, wait for an email from me about the Charlotte, North Carolina area. Because if you have any tips for me in this area, me and my roommate will greatly appreciate them. So, does anyone else have any questions for Stephen before we before we say goodbye? Does anyone else have anything else? Comments, concerns, anything? Oh, a little bit of a quiet room, but that's okay. We soaked in a lot of information today. This was amazing. I was taking notes on my phone while you were speaking. I'm glad we have this recorded because I'm actually really excited to share this with my roommate as she and I are, in this adventure together. But I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing information. I think this is going to be beneficial not only to the people who we see in the Zoom room now, but to everyone else who might come across this video later on. Like he had mentioned, we are going to send an email out when this is done with the recording, and then I'll give you all of his contact information again, just in case you didn't get a picture of his information, the QR code. Otherwise, thank you so much again. Go ahead, yeah. Otherwise, thank you again so much for giving us your time, for giving us an hour of your evening, and to everyone who made it today. Thank you again for coming and for bettering yourselves. Like I always say at the end of these, you didn't just show up for me and the presenter, you show up for yourself. And I think that's really great. Like I was saying in the beginning, yeah, go ahead, clap for yourselves. That's right, Don, give yourself a little bit of a clap. This is a really great conversation. We have a lot more great conversations coming up this week. Tomorrow we have Hannah Lutz. She's done an ASL class with us before, but tomorrow she's going to talk about accessible travel. She just went to Italy and back, so she's going to be sharing her experiences traveling as a wheelchair user, across the pond, as some people say. And then Thursday we have another really lovely person named Annie coming in to speak about accessible college, which is really, really near and dear to my heart because I just graduated college last year. So I'm excited to see what she has to say. And then Friday, we have another friend from Canada. Her name is Brittany. She does a YouTube channel called Empowered Para. She's going to come on and speak a little bit about how to live an empowered life with a disability. So we still have a lot of really great conversations to have this week. If you have not signed up yet, please feel free to sign up and join us for the rest of the week. Thank you again for coming. Thank you, Stephen, for giving us your time and sharing so much good information with us. And I just want you guys to have a really great night. So thank you guys for coming, and I hope to see you guys all tomorrow. Bye, everyone.